With the 2024 NBA season coming to a close, it's time to rank the game's best players. The question I'm answering is, if I'm trying to contend for a championship, who's gonna offer the most value at that level? For a more in-depth look at everything that went into making the list and a full breakdown of my criteria, make sure to check out episode 1. I'll leave a link to that in the description. And without wasting any more of your time, let's continue with the list. Kicking off my top 10, I've got Steph Curry. These last few years for Steph have felt like a slow and steady regression, as is natural with age, but this season in particular really felt like the first noticeable dip. It's mainly been a loss in agility that's made his attack less multifaceted, whereas he used to pair his one-of-one shooting with elite change of direction, burst, and finishing around the rim. Like I said, they've slowly tapered off, meaning that he not only gets to the basket less than before, he gets to the line less, and that right there is two key efficiency drivers coming down a bit. He's able to mitigate some of that regression with his use of the floater and the occasional mid-range bucket, but his two-point scoring in general just isn't anywhere near the level it used to be, shooting below the league's average for only the second time since 2014. This means that more than ever, his scoring is reliant on his three-point shooting. And if you didn't know, he just so happens to be NBA history's greatest shooter, so his scoring is still nothing short of elite. Whether it's off the dribble, off the catch, off of movement, we probably won't ever see a league with Steph Curry in it while he isn't the most lethal outside scorer in the game. And that alone just carries so much inherent value. Because defenses can zone in on it more than ever, coverages have become a little bit easier, but he still requires more game planning than arguably any other player due to his constant movement, range, and quick release, meaning that no matter how much his inside the arc stuff regresses, he's still one of the league's most prominent advantage creators. That would maybe be enough to make him a lock as the league's third best offensive player, but something else happened this year that makes me a lot less confident. What I'm referring to is the way he sort of broke down nearing the end of the season, which is something we've actually seen pretty commonly with aging stars. If we look at his scoring average by month, he started the season his typical self, then slowly but surely tapered off until his last 20 games, where he was barely clearing 23 points. This is what makes me hesitant, because over an 82 game season and potential 20 game playoff run, I'm just not sure he has enough in the tank at this point to sustain his outlandish production. As a result, I think he needs another guy to take a lot of that pressure off of him at this stage in his career, meaning that while 2 or 3 years ago I'd throw him in that top tier of offensive engines, now I think the rest of the pack has caught up to him, and I wouldn't be mad at someone calling him the 4th or 5th best offensive player in the league. That's still some crazy value though, and his off-ball game makes him a seamless fit into any collection of teammates, any system, any setup on the floor, so as long as he's hitting 357 threes at a 41% clip while still creating at volume, he's an MVP level offensive player. As for the other side of things, again, this year felt like a pretty decent regression. I'm not sure how much can be attributed to the situation around him being such a disaster, often playing in lineups where the tallest guy on the floor is 6'5 or 6'6, but he didn't feel like nearly as much of a presence as in years past. Not that he's ever been some high-level defensive guru, but I've always felt pretty highly of him as a team defender. He lacked size and athleticism, yet made up for it with constant activity, timely rotations and switches, good positioning, and most importantly, super sharp hands. This year, that just wasn't there, and I think it comes back to his body not being able to carry the same load. I don't think he's some huge detriment. Like, he can hold his own in some matchups, and the strength he put on over the years certainly helps him in one-on-one situations, but without that team aspect being such a positive attribute, I do feel he's a negative at this point. That brings his value down just a bit, but still a weak MVP caliber player overall and number 10 on my list. Speaking of broken down bodies, the number 9 spot goes to LeBron James. I don't really know what needs to be said about LeBron at this point that hasn't been said already. I definitely think he's lost a lot of his agility and explosiveness as a slasher, yet he's still one of the best in the game when it comes to putting pressure on the rim, both in the half court and in the open floor. He pairs that with the all-time great passing, and I think you get the idea. What stood out this year, though, was the fact that he just randomly decided to shoot a career-high 41% from 3 and an even more impressive 47% off the catch, which I would argue is a bigger deal than people make it. The biggest criticism of his game for years was what he could, or rather wouldn't do away from the ball, but I feel he's one of the best off-ball players in the game right now. It isn't just the catching and shooting, but the extra passing, the cutting, the stampeding into open space to attack a rotating defense, his ability to play like a screen and roll big and counter any coverage. I mean, the guy is just straight up one of the most versatile offensive players on planet Earth, even at age 39. Much like Steph though, I'm a bit hesitant to put him in that top tier because of the sustainability of it all. I don't think he can carry a huge offensive load like he once did, which is why you need other ball handlers on the floor like D'Lo or Reeves for added offensive punch, creating a ripple effect that then starts to hurt the defense. He looked absolutely remarkable in the first round against Denver, but I'm not sure he could have carried that into a longer run spanning 20 to 25 games, especially if that path would have led into the likes of Minnesota or Boston. So in my opinion, the overall product is more like that of a top 5 or 6 offensive player, adding high All-NBA to weak MVP level value just on that end. As for the defense, it's a pretty similar line of thinking. His communication, IQ, positioning, ability to protect the rim or switch on to bigs all make him so valuable at the 4. But the question is consistency and activity, because he just has to take plays off, which does sometimes result in pretty lackluster looking possessions. Also, his lack of left to right agility has hurt his ability to defend out in space, so he's sort of forced to operate more like a big man. Again in round 1, he looked like a defensive demon behind the play, blowing up actions, jumping lanes and forcing turnovers, meeting attackers at the rim, and if this is the type of play that he could sustain for 40 minutes a game over a finals run, he'd be a lock top 5 player. But I just personally don't see it. For that reason, I still think he's a pretty strong positive on defense, just not quite someone who I'd consider great. When paired with the offense, that's enough to get him to a weak MVP level and number 9 on this list. Those two segments are very different from who I have at number 8 because that's the young superstar Jason Tatum. Tatum is probably the player with the biggest disparity between how people view him, meaning that there are those who look at his versatility on both ends for one of the best teams ever and will put him in best player in the world discussions, while there are also those who will look at his numbers, the guys around him, and make the argument that he isn't even the best player on his own team. I personally like the middle ground. The primary reason they're able to run the style of offense that they do with the 5 out, multiple off the catch decision makers is because of Tatum's ability to create advantages. His size, burst, and handle are a nightmare to contain when attacking downhill, and he doesn't get nearly enough credit for being one of the best interior scoring wings in the NBA. He pairs that with a really nice ability to read the defense and consistently make the right decisions as a playmaker, which unlocks the drive and kick style of system that continuously puts them in a position to compete for championships. Many point to his streakiness as a scorer and shot selection as points of criticism, and there's definitely some merit. He can fall in love with pull-up jumpers a bit too much at times, and his in-between game is really lacking, so occasionally you'll see him drive into a packed paint and not really have a counter. I do think those things hold him back from being a top-tier scorer. However, when the 3 ball is falling, he is a top tier scorer, and it's those highs that have led to some truly incredible signature performances. The floor can look bad, we saw it for a few games in the finals, but even on those poor shooting nights, he was creating open shot after open shot for the guys around him, and doing a ton of work away from the ball. This is the part of his game that I don't think gets enough credit. Not only can he create the initial advantage that gets the driving and kicking started, he can fit right into the puzzle as one of the guys playing off of the advantage better than almost anyone in the league. He's an elite shooter off the catch, super decisive attacker, awesome ball mover, and when we're talking about offensive centerpieces, the ability to flex between roles like this makes putting better talent around him so much easier. I think some of the limitations I talked about and the lows being as low as they are in terms of percentages keeps him from being a top 10 offensive player. But I think he's right outside of that, bringing strong All-NBA level play on that end of the floor. What really brings him into this tier is the two-way capability. As we all know, he was the key in unlocking Boston's scheme in the NBA Finals because of his ability to switch across the board, but there's even so much more to his defensive toolbox than just that. He's an elite help defender, whether that's stunting at the nail, tagging a roller, rotating down to offer verticality at the rim. His combination of length, athleticism, activity, and IQ all stand out whenever he's away from the ball. In these spots, he's also an incredible defensive rebounder, which is something that I think people tend to overlook. One of the reasons Boston is able to put so much shooting on the floor or run those switch-heavy units is because of his ability to close possessions at the four. One thing I will say is that as he's put on weight, he's not nearly as fluid defending on the ball, so whereas 2 years ago I would have also mentioned his high-level point of attack defense, I don't think that's as much of a factor anymore. At the time, I would have called him a clear all-defensive caliber guy and a top 5 or so wing defender in the NBA. Now I'd say he's pushing into that territory, and I'd even argue that he has a pretty good case to be Boston's best defensive player. Truly, the reasoning behind him being ranked at 8 though, and why I could even see him sneaking into the top 5 on some lists, is because he is the easiest player in the NBA to build around, and I'm not even sure if it's a debate. The ability to flex between roles on both offense and defense and play multiple positions at any given moment just gives you unlimited options as a front office and as a coaching staff. There isn't a guard, wing, or big in the league that he couldn't play next to. There isn't a system on either end of the floor that he couldn't plug right into. That's why I view him as a weak MVP caliber player and why he gets the number 8 spot on this list. At number 7, we have a guy who at one point probably held the title that I just attributed to Tatum, and that's Kevin Durant. Like I mentioned with LeBron, there really isn't much to be said about KD at this point that hasn't already been said. If he's not the best mid-range scorer in NBA history, he's on the Mount Rushmore. He's an elite off-the-catch weapon across the board, ranging from movement shooting to decisive attacking and quick-hitting pull-up jumpers, and he's probably one of the 4 or 5 players who a defense least wants to leave open behind the three-point line. That arsenal alone gives his scoring such a high floor. What's considered a bad performance for KD would be a standout performance for most scorers, like the Minnesota series where he absolutely torched their single coverage with tough bucket after tough bucket. Notice how I use the terms single coverage and tough bucket though. A theme throughout this list has been how much I value the ability to create easy shots for yourself. Well, KD has that, except easy shots for him are 10 to 15 foot pull-up jumpers and not the type of shots that will consistently put the defense in rotation. At this point, his burst is pretty non-existent, which was very clear when he couldn't even beat Karl Anthony Towns off the dribble. And by playing him in single coverage, the Wolves were pretty much able to negate all of his playmaking. That's not to say he doesn't create advantages, especially with pocket passes out of pick and roll, or quick kickouts after getting doubled in the mid-post, just that he's a guy who can be made into a scorer and tough shot taker more than probably any other player in the top 10. So, like LeBron and Steph, it's really an age thing. He's still one of the best offensive players in the game, but not quite at that peak level, rather on the border of top 5 or so. As for the defense, I do think I saw some regression this year, even if marginal. He had quite a few off-ball lapses in the Minnesota series, which has always been his biggest flaw on that end, but they felt a little more consistent, and to me that's a signal that his motor doesn't have as much juice. However, the strengths are still very prominent, those being his length and agility, which not only allows him to protect the rim at a high level, but switch onto all types of different matchups as his team sees fit. So I would still call him a positive defender in most situations. This current state of Phoenix might just be the worst possible situation for him defensively, and I still feel like he fared pretty well. When paired with the regressed, yet still amazing offense, that gets him to the number 7 spot on this list. Whereas last episode was all about young guards, this one's all about the old guys because my number 6 is Kawhi Leonard. Remember, it's important to note that this list is evaluating these guys at full health, and it's really difficult to overlook that stretch from Kawhi where the Clippers looked unbeatable. You always hear about guys being 3-level scorers, and Kawhi's one of the rare ones who actually utilizes all 3, not just at volume, but with incredibly high efficiency. Much like KD, he's an unreal shot maker, both inside the arc and behind it, and he too has the incredible court warping length. The difference with him is that he's got a significantly tighter handle, is way stronger, and uses that to force his way into more pressure points within the defense without turning the ball over. For these reasons, I think he'd look a little bit better as a scorer in the playoffs at this point. However, you should take that with a grain of salt because he's barely played any playoff minutes in the last 3 years, so it's all speculation. The last time we actually saw him healthy in the playoffs was 2021, and if I still thought he was that player, I wouldn't be talking about him just yet. I do think there's been some regression, most notably to his agility and burst, and I think he's a bit more reliant on difficult shot making than in years past, which is something that could hurt him if we ever do get to see him over a playoff run. The main reason I'm a bit lower on him than in years past comes back to the injuries. I know I said this is a full health ranking, and I stick to that, but at some point you have to account for the fact that what he looks like at full health just simply isn't what his sustainable level of play is. In order to stay healthy for a season or a playoff run, he cannot carry the offensive load of really any other star in the league, and I do think that takes him down a couple notches. With that said, he makes up most of that ground on the defensive end. No, he's nowhere near what he once was, but that doesn't mean he isn't still great. He's not as effective against guards as he's lost lateral quickness. When it comes to wings and forwards though, his combination of strength, length, and sharp hands is arguably more imposing than any other player in the league. Those last two things, the length and hands, are also what help him bring value away from the ball, whether it's helping on drives, erasing passing lanes, meeting guys at the rim. He's a guy who can play many different roles on defense. Though, I will say that his processing as an off-ball defender isn't the greatest, and he will miss rotations, fall asleep, which when paired with age and injury history sometimes call into question his consistency. I still think he's a great defender, but not quite at that all-defensive level anymore. So instead of a strong MVP and top 5 player, he's a weak MVP and number 6 on this list. Real quick though, I want to make it clear just how tight this range of players is. 6 through 11 for me is about as interchangeable as it gets. If you had AD at 6 and Kawhi at 11, or Tatum at 6 and KD at 11, any order of these players I really would not disagree with. It's really just splitting hairs to me, and it all comes down to what you personally prefer in a style of player. What I ultimately landed on, just to recap, is Kawhi at 6, KD at 7, Tatum at 8, LeBron at 9, and Steph at 10. Make sure to tune into tomorrow's video for the final 5 players. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my notifications on to be first on more content. If you're interested in my more in-depth research, make sure to check out my website and social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you think of the list so far. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.